People know about it, they laugh at it, it is definitely stigmatised, but the fact is hundreds of thousands of people listen to it.
Dr. Maureen Sinton, producer, programmer, listener.
Another listener said, this listener was quite left of centre, and he was saying, I want to know the enemy.
You don't watch film or television that you don't enjoy to prove to yourself that you don't enjoy it. But for some reason, within the talkback environment, some people do engage with a product that they know they're likely to not agree with.
The talkback is a spectator sport, and the listener is the spectator.
What I can say is that it is clear that this is one of New Zealand's darkest days.
I mean, there were people put to air who quite early on flagged that the number of casualties was going to be quite high. It was awful and compelling listening.
When I say talkback radio listener, you probably picture some grandpa pottering around his kitchen, putting on a cup of tea and getting ready to call up the host to talk about politics. And what about the silent actors in the talkback transaction? What about the people who tune in but never call up? Because not everyone wants to have their opinion broadcast live across the country. Some people just want to listen in. But why? Is it to have their views affirmed? Is it to get outside their personal echo chambers and be challenged? Or is it simply to be entertained by the pure liveness and authenticity of the product? Because talkback radio is alive and well in 2023. And you'll be surprised by what it has to teach us about our society. Let's listen in to Dr. Maureen Sinton. This is PhD Unpacked. Before we get into the research, can you tell us a little bit about your personal background, how you ended up in the academic field after a long and distinguished media career, and ultimately why you wound up writing this PhD specifically?
So, grew up in Whangarei, born and grew up in Whangarei. Always loved radio from a very young age. This sounds weird, but it's true. My mother was the tea lady at the local radio station, and you know it's good in a town like Whangarei to it's not what you know, it's who you know. And so, at the age of 16, and this was the days when they took on cadets, and you got paid to learn. So I became a Radio New Zealand cadet. This is in the late 70s. But most of my career was actually spent in Wellington, working on a show called The Tonight Show, which networked across Aotearoa. And The Tonight Show was a mixture of music, interviews, talk, and talkback. And that's when I first started producing talkback shows, and I really enjoyed that aspect. Then I did my OE, came back, no jobs in radio. So was in television for another 17 years, as you said, a programmer and production producer. Then took a break, couldn't decide what I wanted to do, and then decided that I'd actually go and do that university degree that I didn't do the first time around. So 9 years ago, I started as in Te Arapautama doing a Māori Development and Social Science degree, undergrad, and then I moved over to the School of Comms at AUT, Communications, and did a Master's on Interactivity on radio, on public service radio, Radio New Zealand in particular. And then when they said, hey, why don't you stay on and do a doctorate, my choice of thesis was a sort of an extension of my Master's in terms of it was continuing on the theme of interactivity. Talkback is a form of interactivity. People know about it, they laugh at it, it is definitely stigmatised, but the fact is hundreds of thousands of people listen to it, although it's very hard to find someone who admits to listening to it. But I've always been intrigued by that fact that so many people listen, but so few people will tell you they do.
For anyone that might be listening that doesn't know what talkback radio is or needs a slightly better definition, can you define exactly what talkback radio is specifically as a genre within the kind of wider radio landscape? Because there's lots of different kinds of radio, right?
Well, it's probably appropriate that I start off making that definition by emphasising that there is a difference between talk radio and talkback radio. It's something that's noted in Australia and New Zealand. We both sort of inclined to call it similar names. We talk about talk-based networks or talk networks, and that usually includes, or a talk station or talk network, and that usually includes some part of talk radio, and some part of it is talkback. Talk radio generally is, and the best way I can explain it is what Mike Hosking does on News Talk ZB, where he has he's prearranged interviews, he has his own commentary, and it's an entertainment and informational program, obviously. Talkback is different in that it's where the majority of the content is provided by the listener. It's not prearranged. Certainly the messages and the calls are screened. So in that respect, you could say prearranged, but they're not set up in the same way that you have with talk radio. So Mike Hosking, just using the current example, Mike Hosking is talk radio. Kerry Woodham between 9 and noon is talkback radio. It's when callers are ringing in and being put to air and discussions are had with the host.
Do you know exactly when talkback started? I imagine it was people calling in off landlines at some point when that was the only way you could get in contact with a radio host.
I could sit here for the next 2 hours and give you the history, but I'll give you a brief history. 1927 was actually is in the Herald. It's recorded as the first attempt at talkback. These guys working out of what used to be the 1ZB studios and then became 1ZB later. This one particular announcer decided, wouldn't it be good if we could actually get the listeners calling? Wouldn't that be amazing? And they experimented and they got it. They got it working, but it was all I think it was too wild and crazy for the management at the time. So it got put aside, and then it wasn't addressed in New Zealand again till 1965, when what was then the NZBC, which became Radio New Zealand later, the NZBC decided to experiment with it, with the concept, and they just to trial run. They ran to Masterton, Lucky Masterton. The talkback was trialled there, and it was in the what would have been called the women's programming in the afternoon, and it was called telephone time. And people were encouraged rather to ring up with favourite recipes or how to remove stains from blankets or how to deal with a burnt saucepan. I remember my mother listening to that when I was growing up in Radio Northland. And then in 1968, 2ZB Wellington, also always being innovative, they started this program called Party Line, which was the first general issues talkback. And it was hosted by a guy called Paddy O'Donnell, which was a heck of a risk by 2ZB in that time, because Paddy was anyone who remembers him will remember that he was a bit of a maverick and a bit out there. So it was a bit of risk to have this guy running a talkback show. But that was 68, and it went for quite a while. And then the next big sort of step was when private radio had started in the early 70s, and Radio I in Auckland became very well known for its talkback programs with people like Eccles Smith and Tim Bickerstaff. And in Wellington you had Brian Edwards on Radio Windy. And then, so talkback was just sort of becoming a regular part of what was offered as a format. And then the next big momentous event in terms of the history of talkback in Aotearoa was the beginning of News Talk ZB in March 1987, when what had been a sort of an all things to all people station, 1ZB, became News Talk ZB. It's still going, and it's incredibly successful. So talkback has had a very healthy and long history.
You make it clear in your PhD that most of the focus in terms of researching talkback radio in the past has been focused on hosts and callers, which is not the focus of your piece of research. It's all about the listeners.
Yes.
Something you label as the silent actors in the talkback transaction. Can you tell us about why, I guess, that focus on listeners, to go from I know talkback is where I want to focus, but actually who are the people that we're not investigating, that sort of drive to explore listeners?
Well, I think the key drive was that there's many more of them. There's hundreds of thousands of listeners, there's a few hundred callers, and there's half a dozen or a dozen at the most talkback hosts. So there's more of them to find out about, which makes them more interesting. But as you said, they're also, it becomes a little bit, I was intrigued by it because you can hear the host and you can hear the caller and you can do a content analysis on what the callers are saying or what the host is saying, or both. Or you can do a discourse analysis. This is in terms of methodologies if you want to study them. And there has been a lot of that done already, but not a lot of literature that I could find was about why the listener and what are their motivations. What are their motivations to listen? And and as we'll probably get into, there is a stereotype of the talkback listener, which I challenge in my thesis. So I just thought there was a gap.
Yeah, and there's this fascinating piece of discussion in the literature review part of your PhD that is all about, I guess, questioning what it means to listen. I thought that was really interesting. The consideration of, is listening passive or active, and when is it perhaps either? You're not the host, you're not someone that's calling in or texting in for whatever reason, but that doesn't mean that you're not actively engaging in whatever that product is, the audience. That's really fascinating.
There's a quote that I take from a chap called, I hope I get his name right, Robert Jourdain, who talks about the fact that hearing is passive, but listening is active. So you passively hear, and then you tune in and out, and then you actively listen. And another scholar in this area, David Hendy, he described it as a continuum. Listening as a continuum, where at one end you have concentrated listening, where people are sort of almost leaning in, even if their ears are leaning in, even if they're not physically leaning in. You're listening, closely to what is being to what you're listening to on in the media. But at the other end of that continuum is what he refers to and other people refer to as tap listening, which is where we all know that sense of you're driving along, you're listening to something on the radio, then your mind, you're thinking, oh, what am I going to have for dinner tonight, or what am I going to do when I get to work, and your mind wanders off and then your mind comes back. So that's that sort of tap listening. You hear all the time, but you're only sometimes are you listening, and that's the active part.
Leaning into the research itself, could you tell us briefly about the methodology? Well,
as I said before, you can't hear listeners. You can't hear what they're thinking. So in terms of methodology, it was obvious that I was going to have to do use the qualitative methods and do interviews with them. And I was going to interview them. What I wanted to do was interview them to find their motivations. I wanted to know why they listened, what they particularly liked about what they heard. Sometimes, were there things that turned them off in terms of listening. It was going to be a bit of a challenge. I realised it was going to be a bit of a challenge to find people to interview because of what I was saying before. Talkback listening, talkback calling, has a stigma attached to it. People don't stand up and go, yes, I listen to talkback, I love talkback. So I asked around, and eventually I found one or two people, and then it's using that sort of the snowball effect where they talked to people and they knew people. And so I in the end, I was really pleased with the range of people I had. We had a lawyer, a retired maths teacher, we had a property developer, we had a couple of people who are retired, living just staying at home during the day, an insurance salesman. We had a whole range of people.
So what did you find in those conversations? You've mentioned a whole range of professions of people that you spoke to. Is it that the answer is just there's huge diversity and probably kind of almost everyone listens to talkback, or there is such a range that it is just a diverse audience?
There is a really diverse audience to talkback. One of the reasons that I think people are inclined to think of talkback listeners as sad, old, lonely people, is that because the callers they often hear, they're inclined to hear callers and think the listeners must be like the callers, which is so often not the truth. I mean, the whole stigma goes back to there was I don't know if you remember, there was a classic movie in 1971, Play Misty for me, was a Clint Eastwood movie. Heads up, it wasn't a Western, but it was about a parasocial relationship between a DJ and a listener, and another heads up, it didn't end well. But it was all about the imbalance of power. So that sort of starts nurturing that, and in fact, that topic of parasocial relationships, that had been studied as far back as 1956 with some researchers, academics Horton and Wall, who talked about the imbalance of power between a performer and an audience member, and how the performer has no idea the audience member exists, but for the audience member, the performer is everything. So inevitably, the audience member in that case is probably not, is potentially one of those sad, lonely people. So that's where I think that the stigma has come along. People think if you listen, you must be like the callers. And and the callers do fall into a certain genre. I mean, that's another whole study. and many other people have studied callers, which is why I sort of avoided them. But yeah, you can't cut and paste the definition of a caller put it on a listener. And they're too diverse.
And there's probably also a lot of people who would not consider themselves to be talkback listeners that haven't really sort of woken up and smelt the roses and realised that the radio that they engage with is talkback radio, especially when we consider, the 2020s, as talkback has changed. It is no longer simply people calling up to how do I get the stain out of my saucepan. You've spoken in your PhD about music radio stations that all the time in the movie, on the drive to work, call up. Random example, what is the worst habit that your pet ever had, and people are calling up, whether it's to win a competition, to get concert tickets, or simply to have their voice be on the radio. All the people that are sitting in the cars driving to work, they're listening to that, and it might not be that traditional, what we think of, 20th century talkback, but that is talkback radio. Absolutely, and this is something that I find quite amusing. That as you say, I mean, I listen to myself. I listen to the ZM network, and their breakfast show is full of call us now with the most embarrassing thing your parents ever did. At least twice a day, twice a show, you've got people calling in, which is talkback. With RNZ, for example, they also have a lot of interactivity through using text messages. But also, you can tell that they'll be discussing a certain topic, and then the host will be saying, "Oh, we've got Peter on the line, and Peter's going to tell us you've been through this situation, have you, Peter?" Yes, and it's quite clear that someone has messaged in with their own experience, and they've been rung back because the number's there, and put to air. It's another form. It is talkback. It's not another form of talkback. It is talkback. So talkback, is a form of interactivity that is now just to be found everywhere. So in a way, it may lose its stigma or may not. People will continue, I think, will continue to think of talkback as associated with, first-time caller, long-time listener. Yeah. The famous line, which was even used in Bart Simpson, in The Simpsons, by Bart Simpson on one occasion, which was funny. It feels to me that with lots of radio programs and lots of radio networks, there is this drive to get the people that are listening to be part of the conversation. So that's more of a conversation. And I think that maybe it's sort of with the technology of, text messaging, emails, social media, it's so much easier for radio hosts to get through a bulk of opinions in a much shorter period of time. That has sort of meant that Talkback has kind of grown and grown and grown.
When mobile phones came in, and even before smartphones, just mobile phones, people could then start calling from the beach or wherever, the boat, or out for a walk or whatever. You could, or from the work site, you could suddenly, the number of people who could contribute in terms of phone calls went up, and that the better the range of people to choose from for the producers to choose from who we're going to talk to next, the content then became way more varied. And then you had the advent of the smartphone, which allowed for texting, and suddenly, whereas a call might take 3 minutes, 3, sometimes 5 minutes average call, suddenly if you get a text and with a person's point of view, you can read that out in 20 seconds. So suddenly the content is way more interesting, way more varied, and that also will, I think, contribute to why, as a form of interactivity, it feeds so well into today's radio.
I want to return back to this idea, I guess, of the active listener, because I feel like that's kind of at the core of what your research is exploring, and this idea of listening to something rather than just hearing. And there's this really great couple of sentences from your PhD that I want to read out. Talkback, comprising as it does entertainment, information, pathos, and scintillation, rewards the often alone listener with the opportunity to be absorbed by what they're hearing. Listening, maybe. As an example of polyphonic discourse, a range of opinions or observations, each one is valid as each other, expressed and curated, not for those who call, but for those who listen. Everywhere, we're constantly being encouraged to, listen to voices outside of your friends and your family. Do you think it's fair to think of Talkback and the listenership as an aspect of that, in terms of people listening in to hear the opinions and the stories and the narratives and the thoughts of people they fundamentally just don't know?
They don't know, and also may not agree with.
Yeah.
I mean, the Talkback has often been described as the backyard fence, where neighbours come together and chat and but I'm not sure if the backyard fence analogy stands up as much as it used to, because I think now people are used to hearing a wider range, for all the reasons I was just explaining. There's a wide range of opinions. There's more chance that you'll possibly disagree, or that someone will have a wild, crazy idea, and it may be a new perspective that you haven't thought of. And that's some of the feedback I got from the people I spoke to. A lot of them didn't actually agree with what they heard, or didn't agree with the callers rather, and sometimes not. They didn't agree with the host. In a way, that gave them incentive to listen. Yeah, one of my listeners was a woman in her early 30s. She worked with rangatahi youth and college-age youth, and she was quite a liberal woman in terms of politically. She was a great listener to Leighton Smith, who's no longer on air, but he was, on ZB for a long time, for something like 30 years. And, clearly sort of quite right wing. She said she listened because she wanted to hear how he and the callers, the people he put through, how did they come to the decisions or the reasoning? What was their reasoning? How did they come up with their ideas? And I mean, another listener said, this listener was quite left of centre, and he was saying, I want to know the enemy. He said, I listen so I can know the enemy. So it's not, you're not listening to Talkback by choosing to listen to a particular Talkback show or host. You're not saying I agree with them. The echo chamber may be going on, but it's the caller and the host are in the echo chamber. The listener's on the outside of the echo chamber.
You don't watch film or television that you don't enjoy to prove to yourself that you don't enjoy it. But for some reason, within the Talkback environment, some people do engage with the product that they know they're likely to not agree with.
And there's another interesting aspect to that, and that was one of my producers talked about the comfort of consistency. And what he was referring to there was sometimes you get people who, and the woman I was talking about earlier, the teacher, he sort of described someone like that turning on, say, to Leighton Smith one morning and finding out that he's supporting the Green Party would have been absolutely discombobulating for her, and it would have made her feel uncomfortable. They actually get used to the people who disagree with what they're hearing, but they keep listening. They listen for a reason, to be challenged, but they also feel comfortable in that listenership. One of the reasons is if you're listening to someone and you disagree with them, it vindicates where you come from, because you know that they are completely at opposite ends of the socio-political continuum from you.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's a range between, some people will listen to a show, a station, whether it's politics or, it might just be sports, to have, because it's comfortable and they know that the person that they're listening to, the callers that they're listening to, are going to be speaking their language and they're happy to just engage with that sort of familiar community. On the flip side of that, there are people listening because maybe they're not really open to being changed, but it's that listen to what the enemy is saying, listen to the other side, whatever that means, to firm up the position that you don't align with those people. Yep. And then I imagine there is a third group of people that are actually just open to change, to perspectives, because even if you're not saying anything, if you're in the audience, you are in your own mind deciding how you feel about stuff. But I think it's fascinating that there's all those different groups of people. Well,
it's, I suggest in my thesis that Talkback is a spectator sport and the listener is the spectator, and they're watching the game that's going on between the host and the caller. If everyone agrees, then it wouldn't be much fun. It wouldn't be an entertaining listen at all.
Yeah. As you say, it's not the 9 o'clock news. It's. I was trying to think of comparisons of what Talkback Radio is like in other mediums, and sports feels appropriate to some extent. Those kind of TV comedy panels, something like 7 Days, or feels sort of Talkback-ish, and that there's
because
people.
They always have someone who they don't have everyone all agreeing with each other. That would be way too boring.
Yeah. And also to some extent, I guess, and this is probably going off on a different tangent, sometimes reality TV feels like close to Talkback in the sense that you as a viewer, I guess, a listener, you're not there engaging in whatever game show is being taking place, but you are experiencing different sides and forming your opinions of who you like on the show, who you don't like on the show, the sort of side that you're taking. When you describe Talkback Radio like that, it's funny to think of why it would have a stigma, because everyone loves all those sorts of media forms, but all of a sudden if you slap the Talkback Radio label on it, people think you're something else entirely. But the entertainment product thing, I think, is so interesting.
Well, one of the, just going back to what you were talking about before, the not the 9 o'clock news, one of the criticisms, if you do admit to saying that I admit to listening to Talkback, people, some of the reaction I've had is, but how can you listen to that? Thus, people are so ill-informed. I'm not listening to learn facts. I'm listening for entertainment, and as I said, it's a game. I mean, I have to say there's one exception to that, and which we may want to go into in times of crisis. Talkback takes on a whole different role. But I don't. When people say, why do you listen to ill-informed people? I'm thinking, but I'm not. I have my own opinions, and they're not going to change. I'm just listening because it's entertaining.
I guess in both the entertainment form of it, which is down one end of the spectrum of radio. Radio is all just fun and games. Then that other end of the spectrum, which is times of crisis, which we should talk about. it is all about the liveness factor, right? And you speak about this in your research is there's something about talkback radio and listening to talkback radio that we as humans crave, knowing that something is live. And there's this element of kind of authenticity that it feels like it's not all pre-scripted and whatever you're tuning into, whatever the subject and the station, that the talkback, there's something live going on there, and the exchange is different there. Even if you're just a silent part of it, you're in your car or whatever, the authenticity of what's going on feels different than, say, Mike Hosking.
There has been some research that says that if something is being presented as it happens live, it is far more likely to be true. People believe it's happening. And as you say, so it gives an authentication to it.
And then the other side of the authenticity coin is that because it's live, there's kind of that excitement that anything could happen. You know, you're sitting there as a listener. You don't necessarily have to call up to present your opinion, but you have no idea what random Joe is going to call up to offer an opinion. And I guess that's the same with live sport. You never know what's going to happen with those game shows, reality TV. Because it feels less scripted and more off the cuff. That's what keeps people coming back. When the question is, what's the most embarrassing thing that my parents ever did? People aren't listening because they know what the answer's going to be. They're listening because they hope that something really outrageous gets brought on.
It's funny. They want humour. But just going back to something you were talking about before, and this is sort of one of the serious parts of Talkback, and it is something I talk about in my thesis, is the terrible day of the March 15 shootings at the mosque in Christchurch. The Talkback played a big role that day because people were actually calling in, and they were actually people in the area. They were people who were maybe trapped in cars or maybe on the road or having to stay in a building, and we had people calling up, or the station had people calling up, and I can imagine. I spoke to the producer that day, one of the producers that day, and it was a big call to, are we going to put these people to air? This is not, from what I understand, I hope this is correct, that the News Talk ZB office, the 2 or 3 people who are in the News Talk ZB office in Christchurch that day, they were out on stories, and so when this was happening, they weren't right on hand. Initially, they got there very quickly, but initially, it was citizen journalism. They were people, just everyday people were just calling up saying, okay, this is what's happening. A car's just gone by, and police have just gone by here, and this road's blocked off, and I've heard this and I've heard that, and they contributed. It was harsh and stark and sad listening, but they contributed to something, and it was quite an extraordinary broadcast that day, and that was Talkback. And
you think of the number of people that would have been listening to that, particularly within the Canterbury area, to know exactly what was going on. The value of providing something where people can actually just listen, as you say, citizen journalism. The value of people that were calling up in that situation obviously can't be overstated, but the amount of people that were listening in that situation, that you would never question what is the role of someone listening, because in those situations all you want to hear is the range of information that's coming in, which is obviously down that sad, serious, horrific end of the spectrum. But when you bring it back to the other end of the spectrum, it's all just about listening into a platform where multiple perspectives are brought in, whether it's what's going on in a factual situation like that, or it's people coming in and speaking about West Ham and the Premier League and why and why they're rubbish and why the manager needs to be sacked, and that element of people being active listeners is, I feel like, so much easier to understand in a situation like that where everyone would always be listening in with an acute ear to try and figure out what's happening.
I suspect there were people who called that day that had never called before, but they felt that they could contribute, almost from a public service point of view, to let their fellow Cantabrians know what was going on and the rest of New Zealand.
And that only functions in a sort of radio scenario where there's an infrastructure in place to allow people to come on and be a part of that broadcast, and also knowing that there are hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of people out there listening. And
there were people put to air who quite early on flagged that the number of casualties was going to be quite high, and they turned out to be correct, and it was awful and compelling listening, but it would have been a heck of a big decision from the producer's point of view. So, are we going to put these people to air? I mean, it was quite an extraordinary broadcast that day.
When it boils down to it, that's all about community. And you talk about, in your research, one of the easiest reasons to point to why people listen to Talkback Radio is the idea of companionship. It might actually be, it may well be the quote unquote sad old person in their kitchen that's just turning on Talkback because they want to have someone's voice in the background. That companionship might exist in that specific context, but can also just exist in the less one person in their kitchen way, whether it's a car full of people and you're all listening to be a part of whatever that community is with the radio station, the people calling in, and that day, people both in the Christchurch area but also New Zealand generally wanted to feel like there was a conversation going on. And I guess outside of any specific example, that is what Talkback Radio can provide to listeners, is a kind of community that you engage with, even if you're not the person calling up. Because whether it's the host's voice that you're listening to all the time, or you feel like you're part of the strange family of people that listen to this particular radio station in the morning or the evening, I think that element of being a listener within a wider group is a really fascinating thing to consider when we consider the role that radio and Talkback Radio plays within society, and is going to keep continuing to play. Because I'm sure there are people out there that will say, well, radio's dying, radio's dead. Well, it's not dead, because that kind of interactivity, I think, is very specific, and for a lot of people can't really be replaced by anything. That kind of, whatever that interactivity radio magic stuff is.
There's a classic piece of literature by a chap called Benedict Anderson, who wrote a piece on imagined communities, and Talkback is part of that. Well, actually, all radio is part of an imagined community, but particularly Talkback, where you're listening. And I think one of my listeners put it beautifully. She said, when she's listening, she's lying in bed listening to the radio, she said she hears these people calling up. She says, I'll never know these people. She said, they're acquaintances I listen to. And I liked that, And she sort of got to know, you do get to know some of the regular callers as a listener. And she called them acquaintances I listen to. But I don't think, because it is an imagined community, that needs to be a sad thing. I think it's quite nice.
Yeah. There's just something about knowing that there are other people out there in the same city as you or the same country as you, engaging quietly in the same thing, and maybe having their opinions changed or not having their opinions changed. I keep returning to this idea of listenership, and why do we listen to conversations, and applying your research, I guess, outside of a Talkback context, also just in the world, conversations that we engage with. How do we listen? What are the spectrum of hearing versus really active listening? Why is it that we take pleasure or solace or any of these words and absorbing conversations, opinions through the oral medium as something that is never going to go away. So continuing to question that, I think, is fascinating.
I use the term reality radio in my thesis. And sometimes, when you've got people calling up with extraordinary stories, or just stories to tell, or views, and you're listening and you think, wow, I can't stop listening. This is really interesting. It does feel a bit like reality radio.
Yeah, and we will never stop listening, whether you're specifically listening to a radio station or you just happen to be flicking through the channels and someone's chatting to someone on a host on a music channel. That interactivity is always going to be there. And I think it's fascinating to keep thinking about. And thank you so much for being here with us today to explore it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Maureen Sinton, the PhD, is sounding out the long-time listener, a study of the Talkback Radio audience that doesn't talk back in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Maureen, thank you so much for being here. Kia ora.
Thanks for watching this episode from Season 3 of PhD Unpacked. For previous episodes from this season and Seasons 1 and 2, check us out on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as other listening platforms. And follow us, PhD Unpacked, on Instagram and TikTok.